Today's class covers the cheery topic of aggression, violence, and warfare. So, what is the difference between these terms? First, we need some definition. Aggression, your textbook tells us that aggression is behavior motivated by a desire to harm another. I was thinking about that. I'd like to modify that a little bit. For me, it's not the desire to harm another. I can desire to harm another and not be aggressive. So it's really that you're engaging in behavior that threatens harm to another of some kind. So I would say it's the behavior, not necessarily the desire. You can actually be aggressive without desiring to. It's not about, as sometimes they teach us in those classes on what is a microaggression, it's not about your intent, it's about the effect of what you're doing, the effect of your behavior. So aggression means you're in some ways threatening to do harm to another person. Violence is when you actually carry that out. You're doing something and it's hurting somebody else. Physically, lethal or non-lethal damage. Hopefully most of the time it's non-lethal. And then there's warfare. Now to have warfare is not just violence. Warfare means you're engaging in what we're going to define as coalitionary violence, in which you have different two or more people ganging up on somebody else of the same species, and then it's going to have to be organized. So warfare is a form of organized violence which requires cooperation and various forms of control. Now, human beings are a beautiful species. We see this behavior, at least aggression and violence, in other species. But as far as we know, humans are the only ones who will do it just because they don't like somebody else, or for symbols. So in most of the cases when we see aggression or violence in other species, they're fighting over something. So a mate, or food, or territory. In human beings, we of course do that too, but we also might want to simply, we engage in these symbols and we put them upon other people, and then we sometimes do harm to other people, not because we're fighting over anything, just because we're fighting. So, yeah, cheery. Now, you might ask, well, where did we get this from, our unique propensity to do this? In other primate species, we do observe aggressive behavior, so threats of harm. And there are some primate species, bonobos, for example, they're known to be loving to each other, but they also often engage in this aggressive type behavior, but then it dissipates without violence. Chimpanzees, on the other hand, seem to go aggressive and then take it into the violent sphere. So we do observe aggression and violence among other primates. But what we don't usually observe among most other primates is what they call coalitionary aggression. So coalitionary aggression, as I mentioned, when at least two individuals jointly direct aggression at one or more individuals from the same species. So then you're starting to get more organized, you're starting to band together, try to beat somebody else up in your own species. So this is not hunting, for example, it's not considered a violent or a coalitionary aggressive behavior. And the only species that we've really observed this in of other primates are the chimpanzees. So we really haven't observed coalitionary, or much, I would say, coalitionary aggression in bonobos. It's really the chimpanzees where it's the closest thing that we might consider to human warfare. Now I put in there equidistant bonobos because a lot of people, when this was observed among the chimpanzees, they wanted to say, hey, they're just like humans, see, that's where we got it. And in fact, it seems that the bonobos, who are evolutionary equidistant, do not exhibit the same form of behavior. Now, when chimpanzees do this, usually it seems to be focused on a food source, maybe on mating, or in some cases they seem to be able to patrol their territory and make sure other chimpanzees don't come into their area. I would say, well, the most observed case of this, which your textbook talks about, was in Jane Goodall's work in Tanzania in Gombe, who was one of the first people to really live with and study chimpanzees and has shown us so much about what chimpanzee life is like. She was one of the first people to observe chimpanzees using termite fishing sticks for tools use. Just an amazing person, and I don't want to take away anything from what Jane Goodall has done, but I will say that when she started her study, and she's since said that she regrets doing this, the chimpanzees were basically habituated to humans by giving them food and by moving around and relating to them in ways that altered what they might have been like before the humans were there in the wild. And I actually used to show a film of this in my intro class where it showed this chimpanzee rolling a empty can of gasoline down a hill and making a lot of noise. And it said that this chimpanzee had figured out and risen to dominance because he was able to make a lot of noise with this rolling gasoline can. Now, what I'm trying to tell you is this is not something that would have been there before. Rolling gasoline cans do not occur in the wild. And so it was altering the hierarchy and the territoriality of these chimpanzees. It's also the case that this was basically observed and then it didn't come back. So it's relatively unique. And I'll finally say that when we've been observing chimpanzees in today's world, it is often in a situation in which their habitat has been greatly reduced and they're being encroached upon by human beings. And so this aggression, violence, and coalitionary aggression may be an artifact of some of that habitat reduction and human encroachment. What I'm trying to say here is we really don't see much evidence for warfare among other primates. There are some cases that have been observed among chimpanzees, but even those are a little bit iffy as to whether they actually would occur in a more wild setting. For human beings, one of the archaeological puzzles is, well, when do we see violence and warfare in the archaeological record? In general, we have seen busted skulls every so often as early as 800,000 years ago. So they occur in the archaeological record in terms of interpersonal violence. But in terms of what you might consider a mass violence incident or something that shows evidence for this coalitionary organized aggression, we don't see any archaeological evidence for that until about 13,000 years ago. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing this is somewhat surprising to many people. But the fact of the matter is, for most of the human archaeological record that we have, say from Homo sapiens of 300,000 years ago, we do not see organized violence. The first time we actually can see it is 13,000 years ago. Now, it could be that it's just there and we just don't see it in the archaeological record, but it's noticeable that we don't see it for so long and then we finally see it at about 13,000 years ago. So in terms of archaeologically, we have the first documentation of warfare at about 13,000 years ago. And again, for most of Homo sapien evolution, we don't see warfare. Then we see it increase around 7,000 years ago. Now, here's something you may know from previous classes and looking in your notes. What might be something that happens between, say, 13,000 years ago and 7,000 years ago that might lead to increased coalitionary violence and warfare? Yeah, well, tools have been around for a long time. Remember, we have those 2.5 million year old goofy tools, and then we have some tools at about 1 million years ago, which are pretty good. So they are developing their tools, but in terms of being able to do violence to each other, we probably could have done a lot of violence with those hand axes if we really wanted to. Yeah, tools do get more sophisticated, but why? agriculture. Yes, that's what starts to happen here. And so most people, or most archaeologists, hypothesize that this seems to be linked to intensive agriculture and the rise of these city-states, these more densely populated areas, which would then be fighting over territory, trying to get more land to grow things. We have that increase in population. We saw people fighting each other more. So this is not something that arises from our evolutionary history. It really arises from our domestication practices and what people did with agriculture. So it doesn't emerge in all parts of the world, and it comes and goes. It's not that everybody's at war once they developed agriculture, but it does seem to increase in the archaeological record about 7,000 years ago. I'll just add that hunter-gatherers in many cases are, although they're stereotyped as violent, in many cases they're some of the least violent in terms of if somebody's going to come take their land, they're just like, all right, well, move to a different place. It's not that there's no violence, but it doesn't seem to occur on the scale of agriculturalists. So, why do humans do warfare? Why do we do that? Humans are, as we've seen, are a very cooperative species. And for the most part, that's a wonderful thing that we do. We get together, we cooperate, we form teams, we work on problems together, make tools together, and we have, as we've seen, very complex social groups, different hierarchies, different ways of relating to each other, symbolic behavior. And in general, most of us, not everybody, thank goodness, but most of us like to just get along with people. We like to be good, follow the norms of the group, and we like to live in harmony within our group. We don't want to, most of us are just try to get along. But this desire to get along with group norms can sometimes lead to warfare. If your group is coming up against another group, then people can be convinced that you should be fighting somebody else, or that that group doesn't belong to your group. Now, again, I want to emphasize that this is not always, but it does happen, obviously. Now, warfare and violence have come and gone throughout human history. It doesn't seem to be a deep evolutionary thing. And when we look at different groups where sometimes they mention the Guarani, who are in the eastern part of Ecuador in the Amazonian region in South America. And the Guarani were pretty famous for being both a hunter-gatherer group, but also had a very high homicide rate. So they did have a pretty high interpersonal violent society. But over time, they changed and became more peaceful and started more political protests instead of homicides. And we see this in all kinds of different parts of the world. The Guarani are a case they use, but in all different places, we see that sometimes people get more violent and sometimes people get less violent, and it can shift back and forth. So it's not something that is inbuilt into a human group or inbuilt into a culture. One of the most famous examples in Europe are the Vikings, who were these feared people of the north, and you go to those countries now and they're all the most chilled people you can imagine. So at one point they seemed to be crazy violent, marauding everybody else, and now they're just up there being all Scandinavian. Our textbook talks about, well then, how do people get ginned up for warfare? What makes them do it? And they list several things that happen. One is simply rhetoric. Again, people like to get along with other people, and we express ourselves symbolically through language. But that can lead to ideas about what is going on in the world. We can create symbols and ideas about other people and other places, which can be, put up the next word, which can be dehumanizing. So dehumanizing rhetoric are ideas about other people which might try to make them into animals. Your textbook gives the example of people being made in the images of rats or mice. And so various ways in which people try to take another group and try to remove that status of being human from other people. They mention the idea of metaphor theory, which we saw in the chapter on language, is simply that we get very primed as human beings to see the world in terms of the language that we use. So in the same way that we can talk about how we orient ourselves in the world, north, south, east, west, for example, if you remember that film and the linguistic anthropology and how that might orient ourselves, we can also orient ourselves in terms of how we see another group of people within our society or in other societies. So if you remember, we also talked about the example of how in Hungary, the Roma community was basically dehumanized by talking about them as gypsies and gypsy crime and gypsy criminals, using these kinds of dehumanizing terms to talk about other people. One of the puzzles of this violence and warfare stuff, which your textbook asks as a question, is why is it mostly the guys? Why is this mostly men that do this? And if you look across primate species, aggression and violence is predominantly something that the men are doing. Now, it's not exclusive to men. There are certainly instances and whole groups in which women can be aggressive and violent too, but as a general rule, this seems to be the case among different primate groups. For humans, it seems to have something to do with being able to, I call it identity signaling, these values, say, of masculinity, and you want to adhere to those values, and so you signal that by being aggressive or being violent. Also trying to gain social status, to rise up in the hierarchy, and these ideas about military and warfare. To go back to our metaphor theory, there are so many, if you start to think about our language and how many phrases that we use that are imbued with violent rhetoric, but it's just everyday language. Even a phrase like, just shoot me, it's just a weird thing to say when you think about it as a phrase. That said, it's not the guys go out and naturally involved in military coalitionary combat warfare. For the most part, to actually get people to participate in an army, you have to go out, you have to put them through basic training, which is often a process of humiliating them and drilling regimes of authority into them. It takes months or even years to get people ready to go out and be a fighting force, do combat warfare. And even in these intensive training conditions, which also often historically have involved drugs or other ways to hep people up, even after that, a lot of people then come home from that with these long-lasting psychological effects. So what I'm trying to say is that even for guys, even for men, the violence and the aggression doesn't seem to be an innate thing. It's something that we can use in our culture. We can do it to people. We can rev people up. But for the most part, a lot of people traditionally basically resist this. People don't usually want to sign up for this unless you're defending something that is close to you. Even I might get violent if somebody's coming in and stealing my food or threatening my kids, but in general, people are not. This is not something that most people are naturally prone. In this chapter, your book then turns to another idea or a concept called structural violence. And structural violence is a term that anthropologists use. It actually was coined by the anthropologist Paul Farmer, who was an anthropologist and a medical doctor and worked in Haiti. And what he was drawing attention to is that violence, there is obviously the violence of physical aggression that we've just been talking about, but there are also ways in which we structure our society so that some people are at the bottom of things or left outside of things, and there may not be anything explicitly done to other people, but nevertheless, the way society is structured can result in some people having higher rates of illness, less access to health care, and that means that they're going to be suffering and dying at a higher rate than others in the population. And so structural violence is not something that you necessarily need a gun to do. It's the way that societies can be structured, both between different societies and within a society, so that certain people are bearing the brunt of this inequality. Your text gives us the example of what is termed settler colonialism. So in many parts of the world, the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, people from European societies set up these relationships in which they displaced indigenous or native peoples and set up new forms of government. And one of the things that was done, for example, in the United States and Canada, was that you would, for one, locate indigenous people on a reservation, but then people would take the children and put them in boarding schools and remove them from their group. So you'd take the children away from their parents and put them on trains and take them far away. And this led to various things, but one of the things that your textbook talks about is language death, because then you're not exposed to your indigenous language at home. You're told only to speak your English in school, or French or Spanish, depending on where these things occurred. And then the language suffers, if not goes away. So this is one of the reasons I was so upset when they were talking about Indo-European languages in the Americas and Australia and New Zealand as being an example of economic opportunity, because here we have it, not too many pages later, they tell us that in fact these settler colonial policies are what led to the imposition of Indo-European languages in these areas. Now, there were, in these boarding schools, there was actually also, we now have archaeological and other evidence that there was also aggression and violence toward the children. But in general, this is something that people thought was a good idea, that they were helping people, turning them into civilized Christians this way, but it resulted in a lot of structural harm. And so our textbook talks about how these kinds of things, even though they may not be in the present, they still set up this relationship of ruler and ruled, which they call coloniality. So even though a whole country might be independent of a colonizing country, that doesn't mean that those relationships have all gone away. Those hierarchies have been established within that society. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is how long this lasted. In the United States, this was up into the 1950s and 1960s. So there are people who are in New York State who were taken from their people and put into boarding schools who are still around and alive today. So this has happened. It wasn't too long ago. It's not like, yes, it did happen a couple hundred years ago too, but it was up until pretty recent. At the end of this chapter, your textbook talks about 4 ways in which people fight back: resistance, refusal, revolution, and reconciliation, which we'll go through each of these in a second. So these are 4 ways, 4 R's, words for how people might try to deal with the hierarchies that they have encountered. This does not have to be violence or aggressive. Sometimes it can be, in some instances, but it's just ways in which people are going to resist the hierarchy that has been established. So your first one is resistance, which means you are in some ways trying to resist fight back against an injustice. So sometimes these can be public, circulating a petition, trying to get people on your side, boycotting, going on strike. These are all public ways in which you're trying to marshal public attention to your cause and publicly resisting. There are also hidden resistances. So you're working in an unfair conditions, but you're not really doing all the work that is being told that you should do, or leaving jobs, poaching different animal species, or occupying land that is not supposed to belong to. All of these can be forms of resistance which are hidden in the sense that they're not trying to draw attention, but they're nevertheless trying to create a space for people in these places. When we're talking about language death, there is also the resistance of reopening schools and trying to teach people in languages that have been compromised or lost. So among indigenous groups, Native Americans today, that's one of the things that people are trying to do, is to bring back languages that were lost before, were almost dead, but are trying to be revitalized today. The line between resistance and refusal is murky. Your textbook says that refusal is acts that reject dominance in ways that go beyond resistance. So it's more than simply resistance. So refusal, I guess one of our classic examples is when people disobey laws or norms or ideas which they think are unjust. Sitting in a different part of the bus, which was against the law. Going to a lunch counter and demanding to be served, which was against the law. So a lot of the laws that we had, people believed were unjust, and people broke the law or refused to follow the law in order to create social change. In terms of settler colonialism, there are indigenous groups or native groups who reject the idea that they are bound by contemporary nation states. And so the idea here is that they are their own government or their own nation. In fact, in Canada, many of the indigenous groups there refer to themselves as First Nations, which is to say we were the First Nations here. You're not in charge of us because we have sovereignty or authority over our group. And in some cases, in some of these instances, people in these groups have said, no, we're not going to be citizens of your country. And so, supposed to be, or we're not going to be identified by the labels that you're trying to put on us. Your textbook gives us an example which is not very far from here. An anthropologist who was working in this area of what is known as the Mohawk territory. And traditionally the Mohawk territory was larger than this, but in today it spans what is Canada and what is the United States. And the Mohawk are technically supposed to be able to cross that border without a passport, and they have their own tribal papers. And this has come into conflict with what other people want to do. So they give us the example of a Mohawk anthropologist, Audra Simpson, who talks about how people are trying to refuse to accept that citizenship and trying to in some ways create their own national or their own identity, which is beyond the rule of Canada and the United States. It's complicated, I will say, but it's an interesting political position. So we have resistance, refusal. We also have people who challenge the state and want to create a new government. What's that called? Revolution. A revolution. Yeah. The good old revolution. So we sometimes think of this as a violent activity, and in some cases it is carried out through violence. But in many cases or in other cases, This is something that if you simply have a large group of people protesting, a government can fall, and another government can be established non-violently. So a revolution aims to change the conditions of the government. Finally, and perhaps to end this chapter on a more hopeful and cheery note, even if it's not always a cheery process, the idea of reconciliation, which begins with simply exposing truth about what has happened in society or in the past. So, for example, in some of these boarding schools where Native Americans were taken, it might be archaeological evidence that they find graves where kids were buried. And so simply exposing that and making it clear that this is what was happening in that place and establishing, well, who did this? Whose fault is this? What is the responsibility? Who bears responsibility for what's going on? Now, the purpose of reconciliation is not necessarily to exact harm or further the cycle of violence. It's to reconcile these things and to try and then move ahead together in a peaceful way, but realizing that these injustices happened and that people were responsible for them. And so you may have missed this in the flurry of weird political news that's been circulating, but President Biden, for the first time, went to a native reservation in Arizona, I think, and apologized on behalf of the U.S. government for the policy that we had of removing people from their homes and putting them in these schools. It was the first time in our history that we acknowledged, or that our government acknowledged they had done this and that it had caused harm. Hopefully, we will see that helps to reconcile the harm that has been done. It doesn't solve it, but it is a step in that direction. So, we want to end on a cheery note in this chapter.